Welcome. My name is Franz Hartmann. I'm the coordinator of the Ontario Greenbelt Alliance, a network of over 100 organizations from across Ontario working together to protect and expand Ontario's world-famous Greenbelt. One of the ways we do this is by working with municipal leaders and officials to find ways to use planning tools to help overcome key local challenges, especially those related to the growth plan, in a way that also helps the Greenbelt, which is why we're here today. Over the next 30 minutes, you're going to get a masterclass full of wisdom from two planners about how municipalities can better plan their communities to deal with pressing local challenges while creating conditions that help the Greenbelt survive and thrive. If you are a mayor, a councillor, municipal staff person, or community member who wants to learn from experts about how to create more livable, sustainable communities, this video is for you. Now let me introduce our two presenters. Susan Lloyd Swail is a registered professional planner, researcher, and smart growth consultant at Lloyd Swail Consulting. As a former deputy mayor and municipal councillor, she's always eager to engage in discussions about creating healthy communities. Kevin Eby is an urban planner with a broad range of provincial, municipal, and private sector consulting experience. Kevin was the director of community planning at the Region of Waterloo from 2000 until 2015. And was also a member of the Provincial Greenbelt Council from 2018 to 2020. Now over to both of you.
Thank you, Franz. Kevin's just going to get the slideshow up here for us. Thanks, Kevin. So the challenges we are facing today are unprecedented. How we plan our communities affects housing, taxation, farming and food industries, transportation patterns, climate and watershed health. In short, our shared prosperity. To paraphrase Albert Einstein, now is not the time to turn the page back to a 1970s growth model. Despite changes to the growth plan and thousands of hectares of farmland lost to urbanization, we have failed to provide housing most people can afford. It's going to take innovative approaches, good policy, data, and sharing of best practices to plan affordable, healthy, livable communities. Next slide, please. In Ontario, less than 5% of the land base is capable of growing food. Prime farmland is disappearing at an alarming rate, mainly due to urbanization. For these reasons, all three farm organizations, the Ontario Federation of Agriculture, the Christian Farmers Federation, and the National Farmers Union all support hard urban boundaries. Recent census data indicates the number of private dwellings, which include houses and condos, increased more than the population. But one-person households were the most common type of household in Canada. As our population grows through immigration and aging, we need more rentals and apartments. Today, our existing housing stock is mainly single-family homes. In some municipalities, up to 80% of the housing stock is ground-related housing. This is generally unaffordable housing today. We need to restore the balance by building more of the low-cost housing types we need. And financial sustainability. Development charges just don't cover the full costs of greenfield growth, which adds to municipal debt and puts pressure on councils to raise taxes. Studies have found that compact growth is the most cost-effective way for municipalities to grow. And climate change provides both a challenge and an opportunity. It requires us to rethink how we build our communities. In Ontario, the majority of greenhouse gas emissions comes from buildings and transportation. So housing more people and reducing our emissions is a massive challenge. Connected transit aligned with smart intensification helps move more people with fewer emissions. And there seems to be a disconnect between our provincial vision for expansive growth and the vision of many councils and citizens. Bold leadership from Halton and Hamilton regions has halted boundary expansion by prioritizing inward growth over adding more greenfield land, as growing on already designated land can meet their future housing needs. It also reduces farmland loss, greenhouse gases, and is more fiscally responsible. Next slide, please. Since the growth plan was introduced in 2006, we have made significant progress in using land wisely and efficiently. The wise use of land is especially important as we move forward because the growth plan densities, I'm very sorry, I messed up my speech here. So it's really important that we move forward across the region and change the housing mix. In Halton, over 70% of the new housing is apartments, condos, and townhomes. In Newmarket, they recently boasted an 85% intensification rate. So mixed use zoning and urban intensification provides better access to services and makes transit more affordable, which in turn supports economic development and land investment in key urban areas. And as I said, climate change today is especially important for us to address. It's now embedded in public policy, which is a big improvement over 2006. And we know that building compact, connected communities helps us reduce congestion. So now more than ever, we need elected officials, community leaders, and planners all working together. A planning framework that keeps us growing in a fiscally healthy inward direction is critical to our shared prosperity. We've come a long way since 2006, but there are significant challenges we need to overcome with the revised growth plan, which Kevin Eby will now elaborate on. Kevin?
Thank you very much. What I'm going to do over the next 15, 20 minutes is walk through some key issues that municipalities are facing within the municipal comprehensive review processes, particularly about how these issues affect land needs and the need for expansions. And we'll look very quickly at the provincial population forecasts, the housing by type forecasts, DGA densities. The growth plan forecast in the background report has a housing by type forecast. I'll just speak briefly to it, as well as the 2051 planning horizon and intensification targets. So to start with the growth plan population targets, the province actually has two different forecasts that they've done to assist municipalities, and actually municipalities, different groups within the municipalities are required to use each of these different forecasts. The growth plan forecasts or population and employment forecast to 2051, they're reviewed every 5 years. They're based on distribution of the Greater Golden Horseshoe wide housing by type forecast. So they basically take the overall population and determine at the GGH level what number of singles, what number of row houses, what number of apartments are required, and then they distribute them out to the municipalities based on the availability in part of land and servicing. And then they adjust the migration patterns that would otherwise be assumed to occur in order to populate each of the houses. The Ministry of Finance projections, on the other hand, are a pretty standard methodology that's used in planning today. They have a planning horizon of 2046 as opposed to 2051 in the growth plan. They're reviewed annually, and they use standard forecasting inputs and standard migration assumptions. But the interesting part is they're very different. And the growth plan forecast is stated as including planning assumptions. And it apparently results in very different forecasts than if you use the standard methodology. For example, in the region of Durham in 2046, the growth plan forecast includes 5-year increments. So 2046, the growth plan forecast is 210,000 higher than the Ministry of Finance projection. In York, it's 258,000 higher, but it's not all defaulting upwards. In Toronto and Peel, it goes down significantly. So in that case, the Ministry of Finance projection is higher by almost 400,000 in Toronto and 285,000 in Peel. And then just for an example, in the outer ring, Simcoe, the growth plan forecast is significantly higher than the Ministry of Finance forecast. And this causes all kinds of problems for departments within municipalities that are required to use the different forecasts for different things. Planning for 258,000 less in York in one department versus another must create some pretty unusual problems. And at the bottom line is, in order to achieve the forecasts in Durham and York, what's got to happen is the normal migration and population increases we would see in Toronto and Peel have to be held down, because that's where the population is coming from in order to reach the growth forecasts in the growth plan. So some people are very concerned about what if we don't meet these forecasts? What if the Ministry of Finance forecasts are higher and oh my goodness, we're not going to necessarily meet them. The reality is that the Ministry of Finance forecasts over the last little while, especially because of COVID, have gone up and down a little bit like a yo-yo. And in the next year, we expect we'll see something similar because of the war in Ukraine. The rise in oil prices means that an awful lot of people who returned to Ontario in the last 5 years from Alberta are likely going to end up back in Alberta as the number of jobs out there will significantly increase. So my advice to everybody is, don't lose any sleep about the Ministry of Finance forecasts in particular. If anything, the thing I would be concerned about is being over or the forecast being too high in the growth plan forecast, particularly in Durham, Simcoe, and York, because that has significant impacts on the amount of land that's required, development charge collections, et cetera. And just to give you a quick sense of how these forecasts change over time, this is looking at the 2011 to 2021 timeframe in each of the 3 growth plan forecasts that have been done. The left-hand side is the 2005 forecast. The red column is the total number of new units that were expected, dwelling units. The gray is the number of single detached dwelling units. And as you go from the 2005 forecast to the 2013 forecast to the 2020 forecast, and the 2020 forecast almost represents an as-built because you're only dealing with the 2011 to 2021 time period. So it's already got about 8 years worth of development that was known when that forecast was done. So the growth forecasts for York have gone down significantly. So the credibility behind some of these is somewhat suspect. And if you look at the other major regions around Toronto, they all look almost the same. The forecasts have declined considerably for the 2011 to 2021 time period in all of these. And employment, again, looking just at that time period, again, the forecasts have been all over the place. And in fact, what we're demonstrating, at least in the very near term, is that the growth plan forecasts are not all that reliable when it comes to either forecasting the amount of land that's needed or the amount of development charge revenue that's going to come in for municipalities. So housing by type forecasts. Well, in order to determine how many single, semis, row houses, apartments are required, we use a thing called propensities. And propensities, just for those of you that aren't planners, are the likelihood that something's going to happen. And for those of us that are planners, and I think some days I'd rather be in the former category, as it relates to the LNA process, propensities are the likelihood that people in certain age groups are going to be occupying certain types of dwellings. And they're within the 4 categories that the province provides or requires municipalities to look at: single, semis, rows or townhouses, accessory apartments or units, and apartments. And really the question we need to answer is, will the young people today and those that have recently bought homes, will they choose the same types of housing at the various stages of their lives as the people who've just gone before them did? And the answer to that question is really important, because ultimately it's answering that with the methodology that's used that determines how many singles, semis, rows, and apartments are to be planned for. And oops, if we look at how propensities are determined, there's three different ways. The first is to use very long-term trends. And you see a graph here that came out of an Altus forecast for the developer group in the region of Waterloo OMB here. And you can see on this graph, they start in 1996 and they track the percentages in each of the age groups. And they hit a point beyond which they just simply estimate it out. And the use of very long terms, like I say, 1996 starts to get you back into the time period when the baby boom was still buying their initial houses. The important thing about this one is, although they graphed 1996, they actually went all the way back to 1971 in doing it. And in this particular model, they break the population down into 780 demographic groups and look at it over an extended period of time. And then they track and they start at 1971 and they come through to 2006 in this forecast. And then they look to see if there's trends, and if there is, just what they would consider a small blip, they ignore it, just draw it straight out. And in fact, of about approximately 700 of the 780 demographic groups, they just simply used whatever the level was in 2006. And it's complex and it's, it's quite interesting. The only problem is it doesn't work. And in fact, when you take a look at the trends over the period of time from 2002, what you see here is the region of Waterloo, actual built singles and semis from 2002 to 2021 in blue. And you see the start of a significant trend in 2002 that has just continued on for almost 20 years. And this forecast that was done in 2012 fails to pick it up at all. And so the long look back really does pick up the baby boomers, and the construction that happened in the past overwhelms what's happening in the near term. So it really doesn't work all that well. So the second one is to use the actual occupancy rates in 2016. So if we looked at a 45 to 49-year-old age cohort and 60% of them lived in singles and semis in 2016, you just simply assume that 60% of people of that age in 2051 will also live in singles and semis. And Watson and Associates for York Region did a really interesting look at this particular propensity or the way these propensities work as part of their background work. And in fact, what they found was that if you look at 2016 using that as the basis, and you look at the propensity forecast in the red square, you would have expected about 66% singles and semis, and the reality is they built about 32. And that's quite typical for how these forecasts play out. And in fact, in the city of Waterloo, you can see the actuals from 2009 to 2021, and yet the methodology has singles being built in the next 20 years at an incredibly high rate. In fact, more than double what's been experienced at any point in the last 10 years. So again, a methodology with problems. And part of the problem is that we're changing very quickly. And if change wasn't occurring, those methodologies may work, but that's not what's happening anymore. And there's two big areas, the impact of the aging population. And I'll use Waterloo as an initial example, and I'll give some Niagara and York numbers as well. But in 2016, there was just over 77,500 singles owned by people who will be over 80 years of age in 2051. And the important part is that's 65% higher than comparable data from 1996. So change is happening and the magnitude of it is huge. And what that represents, so we're talking single detached units owned in 2016, that the owners will be over 80 years of age. And that's 68% of all the singles that existed in 2016, and actually 36% of all dwelling units. If I look at Niagara, when you look at Niagara, 72.4% of all the dwelling units were owned by people that'll be over 80 years of age in 2051. Like, these numbers are stunning numbers. And although York and Niagara, at least I didn't have access to the special run and the census data that you need to really get down to the level of detail Waterloo has. If you assume an even distribution of housing types by age, there's almost 90,000 single detached units that were owned in 2016, where the owners will be over 80 years of age come 2051. And these numbers, we argue all the time about whether seniors will continue to age in place or not. These numbers don't really even depend on that, because the vast majority of these people will actually be dead in 2051, as opposed to picking what type of housing they're going to choose in. That decision will have been made for them by nature. If you look at York Region, and again, I don't have the specific data, but looking at the overall population distribution, again, the group that's going to be over 80 years of age in 2051 is huge. And in fact, represents a significant portion of the owners of single detached units. So, while aging in place isn't an issue or much of an issue with the group 80 years and older, it is for the group between 65 and 80, or that will be between 65 and 80. And what we found in Waterloo in some recent work that we've done is that the rate at which seniors are selling their single detached units in the first, in the time frame, the first 5 years entering retirement, is about 65% higher than the previous generation. So they're not aging in place in the same way that the previous generations did. And in fact, they're turning over their units earlier and more frequently than the previous generation did. And what this does is it brings into play owners of singles that'll be over 70 years of age in 2051. And just increasing that 10 years dramatically changes this analysis as well, because now we're talking 100,000 singles, or 88%, almost 90% of all the singles owned in 2016, or that existed in 2016, will be owned by somebody who will be over 70 years of age. And to give you just some context of what those numbers mean, in the region of Waterloo, we've only built 17,500 new singles since 2006. So these numbers are massive. If I look at, my computer lets me, if I look at Niagara at the numbers over 70 years of age, it's 86.7%. And in fact, we're well over 100,000 units at that point. And again, York, by the time you look at the red dotted line is the reasonably the earliest that somebody's going to purchase a single in the world today, at least. A massive number of them are going to be owned by people over 70 years of age in 2051. And this is a significant source of singles to meet market demand. But there's another side to this equation as well, which is this represents a huge market for alternative forms of housing that are better suited to seniors living, that can be located on the edges of communities so they can age in their community, but not necessarily in their house, that are more available or more readily, transit is more readily available to them. They're easier to provide the broad range of services that are available in communities to singles, if in fact we can cluster them in areas like this. But it's not just the seniors and the aging of the population that's changing. We're also seeing a change in the purchasing patterns of younger people. And when we look at the data, again, from the region of Waterloo, of the new single detached units built in the 5 years before each census period, and those are listed down the right-hand side, we can see that, oh, and I'm sorry, it's graphed as a percentage of singles purchased by each age group. So the percentage up the left-hand side, the age group along the bottom. And what's stunning is how even through the recession in the mid-90s or the early 90s, the housing crisis in 2008 onwards, the percentages were virtually identical year after year. And if it stayed this way, this would be the type of thing that allows you to look backwards and extrapolate forward. The only problem is it didn't stay this way. And in the 2011 to 2016 timeframe, there's a significant change that's occurred, and the younger people are delaying their purchases by between 5 and 7 years. And it has a decreasing impact or an increasing impact on the market, because fewer singles are being sold to younger people, and we're seeing an increase in supply at one end, a decrease in demand at the other, and it creates for a very different scenario moving forward than we've experienced. So when we look at this and we recognize the other ways of doing it don't work, how should propensities be determined? And in fact, municipalities need to forecast them, and planners need to do their job and look into the future and look at the various conditions that we see that are evolving, the conditions, some of which have only recently arisen. For example, in the region of Waterloo, none of the forecasts that we saw in the region of Waterloo that I've shown took into any consideration the construction of the LRT, which has dramatically changed the nature of housing and the urban form in Waterloo. So, that would be a good example of the second bullet, conditions which have only recently arisen. And then there's predictable conditions that may not even exist in the historical data yet, and climate change, everything surrounding that. There's a whole series of changes that are going to need to occur that we should be considering as we look at this. And in Waterloo, Watson and Associates did a forecast for the region of Waterloo that does this to a great extent. And you can see the differences between this and some of the other forecasts, that in fact, it is fairly representative of the trends that have occurred. You're down in the 19% range for singles. This is their MCR forecast. And in fact, if I was a betting man, I would say it's going to end up somewhere lower in the 10 to 14% range. DGA density targets. And one of the things that not a lot of people realize is that the way the density targets are calculated today is different than the way they were calculated using the 2005 growth or 2006 growth plan, which is what's in your official plans today. So a density of 50 that's required by the growth plan policies into the 2019 growth plan equates to only about a 40 or a 42 density using the 2006 growth plan. So in fact, when they proposed 50 today, they're actually proposing, the equivalent of what's in your official plans today, something that's significantly lower than what you have already. And in fact, the 50 DGA density required by the 2019 growth plan is lower than many municipalities were achieving in their DGAs before the first growth plan ever came into effect. In Waterloo, we were averaging somewhere in the 44, 45 range as far as densities go, which are actually higher than the equivalent of 42, which the growth plan requires today. The other thing was that the 50 was chosen as part of the preparation of the first growth plan to achieve transit supported densities. And it was right on the bottom edge of achieving transit supported densities, but the new growth plan densities don't even come close anymore to achieving that. So municipalities really need to think about upping the minimum density requirements from the 50 required. And in part because if you use the minimum density requirements, they're very easily achieved. And in fact, they bring in more land than required. I just wanted to really briefly, a lot of people have pointed to the growth plan forecast background report and noticed that there's a housing by type forecast for each municipality in that report. The growth plan forecast background report itself states the housing forecast does not replicate or predict the housing mix that would be determined through each municipality's conformity work. And in fact, that's because it wasn't done for that purpose. It was done, as I described earlier, to distribute population between municipalities. It has no relationship and did not fully consider the full range of local circumstances or trends. And what you find when you look at the forecasts is that the background forecast is that, in fact, they are significantly higher than what you would generate for singles and semis using any type of a reasonable forecast going forward. And this is overlaying the dotted line is the housing, the single and semi forecast for the region of Waterloo, overlaid on what the region of Waterloo is using in its MCR, which, as I said, I think is actually even still a little bit too high. So the growth plan looked at a population or a single and semi detached forecast of almost 44% in the region of Waterloo, when the trends are clearly going in a direction that's quite different than that. In fact, you have to go all the way back to 2009 to get to a point when we built 44% singles and semis in Waterloo. So 13 years ago is the last time we were at what the growth plan forecast says you're going to average for the next 30. There are no conditions that I can think of that would drive us to more singles. There's all kinds of things, factors that are out there that would take you in the other direction. But especially given the massive turnover of singles that are coming in the next 30 years as the population ages, to see it go up in the region of Waterloo, especially at that level on average over 30 years, is completely unrealistic. And those forecasts just simply shouldn't be used. The use of the 2051 planning horizon is something I've heard a lot of people talk about, a lot of people, including myself, when it first came out, they went to 2051, and that extended the planning period from 20 years to 30 years. And most of us figured all that was going to do is just generate even more expansions at the same densities as we'd had in the past, and it was just extending the problem. But I've become a bit of a believer in them, actually, for a number of reasons. Two are listed here. I've got a third one. But they minimize the impact of under forecasted growth. So if in fact growth is happening at a faster rate than what is forecast, you have an extended period of time and a lot of land brought in initially on which to accommodate that faster than expected growth, and yet still have an extended period of time to make course adjustments as you go forward to accommodate that additional growth in the longer term. It minimizes, in fact, it eliminates the need for any consideration of persistently vacant lands. The land needs methodology has this bizarre factor that you're allowed to build in that, in 2051, 2% of all our land is going to be vacant. Therefore, 30 years before that, I need to somehow add in more land to compensate for that, when in fact I'm going to be, re-looking at that every 5 years for the next 20 years, long before we ever get to the point that such a vacancy would actually be of concern. And usually the vacancy factors that people are building in at most would affect the last 2 years of the forecast, maybe 3, which means that we're adding land today because of a problem that we're not going to experience until 2049. And you'll see in the next couple slides, it's completely unnecessary. The other thing the longer forecast does is it can be used by municipalities to mitigate risk associated with bold change, such as freezing urban boundaries. And, kudos to Hamilton and Halton for taking a bold step forward and saying we're going to freeze our boundaries and we're going to work really hard to increase intensification, which is the only way you can really do that. And the longer planning horizon allows you to take that type of bold action while minimizing the risk associated with it. And the reason for that is that every 5 years, it's 10 after a brand new official plan, but typically every 5 years, you're going to be doing exactly the process that's undergoing now, which is updating all the forecasts, updating your land needs assessment, looking at your revenue streams, trying to figure out how you're going to grow. So you have multiple opportunities to make changes if in fact changes are required. So for example, if you decide that you're going to really push the edge and freeze your boundaries, the likelihood is even with a frozen boundary, you have 10 to 15, probably upwards of 20, given how slow growth has occurred, worth of land today, which means in 10 years, you can take a look at whether or not that still makes sense and make adjustments at that time without already having necessarily impacted the housing market. And it's even more so because the planning horizon is going to be extended likely in 10-year increments. So by 2031, the planning horizon will actually be 2061 and 2041, 2071. So how does that play out? Well, if we go to the 2031 MCR and we assume that there was some decision made that we were short 6 years worth of land, I mean, this is a crisis in a lot of people's minds. But if you think about it, we get to 2031, we still had 14 years worth of land supply. And we, in 2031, we'll be extending the planning horizon for 10 years. So after that MCR is done, even if you do absolutely nothing to resolve the issue that potentially causes 6 years worth of land supply, you'll still have 24 years worth. So, and I left intensification targets intentionally to the end. And the reason for that is that increasing the intensification targets represents a viable strategy for municipalities to mitigate the effect of the uncertainty in the growth plan forecast and the changing housing demand. Anybody who says they know what's going to happen in 30 years is dreaming in Technicolor, because there is not a chance that anybody does know. And that's why you have all these opportunities to course correct along the way. But when you think about it, the intensification targets, each increase of 5% intensification above the 50 minimum reduces by approximately 10%, 5 of 50, the demand for land, which is about a 3-year supply in a 30-year planning horizon. So if I go from a 50 to a 55 intensification rate, all I'm really doing is reducing by about 3 years worth the amount of land that I'm bringing in. Well, that brings me all the way back to 2048. So we're 28 years away from, or 27 years away from it being a problem. And what that allows municipalities to do is to concentrate on aggressively promoting intensification. And when you've got a market, especially for seniors related housing, that will potentially help draw seniors out of their single detached units, allowing their single detached units to be recycled for younger people in the populations that'll be coming over the next 30 years, all of a sudden you begin to realize this makes sense. It makes good sense for municipalities to really focus in on, can we increase our intensification rates? And with the longer planning horizon, it gives you the opportunity to do that with very minimal risk and have lots of time, if necessary, to course correct if your efforts have been unsuccessful. So with that, I will leave you. I'll turn it back over to Susan, and thank you if you made it this far through the video. We appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Excellent, excellent presentation, Kevin. So insightful. Lots of learning there. So to reiterate, there are 4 main takeaways from Kevin's presentation. A 30-year timeline provides lots of flexibility in meeting population forecasts. And as good planning requires constant review, municipalities should consider phasing growth and growing up, focusing on intensification, because you can revise and adjust your plans based on achieved growth. Secondly, we need to plan for future housing needs using current trends, build housing units that are affordable to a greater population range, and more variety for seniors and rental housing. The province does not dictate the housing mix, but defers to municipalities to determine that mix. Third, most municipalities have enough land and ground-related housing to last until at least 2041 and likely well beyond if they focus on intensification first. And finally, promoting construction of accessible, low-cost housing for seniors and getting them out of their single-family homes helps us provide more housing stock for young families. So there's great opportunities here that Kevin's talked about. So do you have the right data to meet the challenges that your municipality is facing? Growth needs to pay its way. Are you maintaining your fiscal analysis and doing those studies that are needed to understand what is the cost of greenfield growth? What type of growth is most fiscally sustainable? What are the costs of expanding the urban boundary? And do you have a asset management plan going forward that is implemented along with your official plan? Do you have the opportunity that you need to understand what housing the population can afford? So a City of Pickering study interestingly found out that 80% of the single family homes and semis that they were building were out of reach for their existing population. They just couldn't afford them. So undertaking a household income analysis provides this important data that you need. Also, is your infrastructure capacity mapped? Are you managing infrastructure capacity in existing urban areas to support rezoning and redevelopment and getting those underutilized properties back in action, focusing on infill and intensification? Kevin's, the region of Waterloo is a great example of how to do that well. They did a reurbanization study years ago, very successful. So there's lots of great data sharing out there. There's also great information. I encourage you to use the resources that are available and encourage municipal leaders to show bold leadership. Now I'll turn the presentation back to Franz to wrap up.
Great. Well, thank you, Susan and Kevin, for a great presentation, and thank you for joining us. To get in touch with the Ontario Greenbelt Alliance and to access some great online resources about the issues raised by Kevin and Susan, and also to get into touch with Kevin and Susan, please visit Greenbelt Alliance. That's Greenbelt Alliance, one word, .ca, or just Google Ontario Greenbelt Alliance and go from there. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you soon.